Hey everybody, in today's episode we're going to be taking down these old farmhouse style shutters and replacing them for something way more contemporary with this horizontal slat design on Modern Builds. To build these shutters, I'm going to be utilizing Cedar fence pickets. Why? Well, for one, they're really affordable. Plus, Cedar is naturally weather and water resistant, which is great for outdoor projects. The shutters that were still on the wall were hanging on pretty good, so I went ahead and took measurements so that I could reference these on the new shutters that I wanted to build. I started by cutting my horizontal slats, and I'm going to need a total of 18 of these, 9 for each shutter. Each of my horizontal slats are 11.5 inches long, that way I could get 6 pieces out of each board. I'm using a speed square so that my cuts are all 90 degrees and really clean, along with a finished blade to prevent tear out. The final height of my shutters is about 51 inches without trimming any of these planks to width, which worked out great for me. In this shot, you see me marking lines and then ripping this picket into 3 equal-sized pieces, about 1 3/4 inches, including the thickness of the blade. These pieces are going to be the vertical supports that the horizontal slats are glued and nailed to, along with the frame. Next, I needed to cut them to length, and for my pieces, they were about 50.5 inches long. In hindsight, I would actually cut these a little bit long and then trim them back with a flush trim saw after everything was assembled before we attached the frame. After I figured out which plank goes where, I then flipped them over so that I was attaching these vertical supports onto the back. And I'm going to be using 1-inch long nails. I'm also using Titebond 3, which is an outdoor rated wood glue. I kept a 6-inch speed square with me during this assembly to make sure that everything was going smooth, but since we cut the ends of each of these boards really square, I just needed to make sure they were all lined up. The spacer that I'm using is a stirring stick, and it's 1/8 inch wide like I mentioned before. Here you see me using a long piece going down the length of the whole plank, but later I cut this into shorter pieces and just used them on each end. That way, if there was a little bit of flex or warp in the board, it was still more likely to stay square. And this is probably a good place to mention that if you are working with cedar fence pickets, there's going to be quite a bit of tension in that wood, especially thinner pieces like these vertical supports. But as everything gets assembled, it'll square itself out. That looks awesome, and now we've got no visible nail heads. Assembling these panels face up would probably be a little bit easier or quicker, but like I mentioned just a second ago, I liked the idea of not having visible nail heads on the face of these horizontal slats that I would then need to come back with filler but still be able to see a little bit. The prototypes are looking good so far, but before I build a frame that's going to go around this whole panel, I'm going to sand it with some 120 grit sandpaper to smooth out the face of these boards while it's still really easily accessible. Once the frame goes on, this will be a little bit more difficult. Cedar is a very soft wood, so you don't need to start with 80 grit, but man, does it clean up nice. I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't use this for furniture is just how rough it looks in the store.
That really made a big difference, and this cedar looks great.
Oh, and regular viewers will notice the new Craftsman tools. They're not sponsoring this video, but we are working on some Instagram content together for this project. That's at Modern Builds.
And now let's build the frame.
The mitered frame that goes around these panels are coming out of these pieces that I'm cutting to 1.5 inches wide. And I'm only worried about keeping the 2 outside pieces with that straight factory edge. Since I cut these freehand with my circular saw, I don't want to use the middle piece this time since the edge is visible and it'll reduce sanding. I marked and then cut each piece individually to make sure that they all fit as good as possible. I knew that since my boards weren't perfectly square to begin with, my panel wouldn't be perfectly square and perfect, which means I need to make each piece a little bit different so that it fits its space without any gaps in the corners. My goal was to keep this project limited tools and to use the circular saw for pretty much every cut. If I used a miter saw or a table saw, I could have reduced the small inconsistencies, which would have made all of my panels more uniform, but I did want to show that it was possible to get a clean mitered frame without those expensive tools. I sanded the inside of each of the pieces that make the frame before installation because it would be a lot harder to get to after everything was attached. I used a longer 1.5 inch nail going around these panels, and I used a healthy amount of glue, especially on this end grain, so that this would be as strong of a bond as possible over time. I'm really curious to see how with weather, expansion and contraction affects these panels over time. I don't know if the frame is going to separate or stay together. A lot of outdoor projects don't have quite as clean of a mitered frame, but I am hopeful, and I don't think that anything bad's going to happen. I think they'll stay together and look great. I think there might be a little bit of a gap here and there on the ends of some of my planks, but nothing that you'll notice from a few yards away, which is the distance you see shutters from. If you've got any protruding nail heads, make sure to countersink those before you throw wood filler into all of those holes, and then sand the entire thing with 150 or 180 grit sandpaper. And now these things are ready for stain. But first, I'd like to give a big thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, Squarespace. If you need a website, online store, or just a custom domain, Squarespace is your one-stop shop, and you need zero website building experience. And now, with Fluid Engine, Squarespace's next-generation website design platform, it's never been easier to unlock your unbreakable creativity. Just start with one of Squarespace's best-in-class designer templates where you can edit literally every aspect using their enhanced drag-and-drop technology on both desktop and mobile. Another cool feature is there are no limits to the number of products that you can sell using a Squarespace store, whether that's a physical good, a digital good, or a service product. And if you're somebody that wants to take payments in person, Squarespace has got you covered. By connecting the Square card reader to the Squarespace app, all of your sales, orders, and inventory are up to date online and in person. So to learn more, make sure and follow my link in the description. That's squarespace.com/modernbuilds, where you can build out your entire site before entering any of your credit card info. And then when it's time to make your site live, don't forget to use my code ModernBuilds for 10% off your first site, store, or domain through Squarespace. As always, thanks a bunch to you all for watching and Squarespace for supporting. Now let's finish up these shutters. I was at the store and I knew I wanted a Cedar natural tone, and the only brand that had it in a quart was Valspar. This is a product that I don't think I've used before, but it was the exact color that I wanted and it applied really easily. I used a rag, which actually wasn't recommended, but it was convenient for getting in all of those cracks. The directions actually recommended using a roller or a brush. You basically want to apply this stuff real heavy, let it set for 5 or 10 minutes, and then wipe away where it pools up. I'm pretty sure that these shutters are just held on by construction adhesive, and that's why the ones that have fell down. Hopefully this crowbar will work. Whoa! That was easier than I expected, and we'll get this mess cleaned up. I wasn't worried about getting all of the adhesive, but where it was built up thick, I did want to chisel down. And I've got a really basic idea on how I want to hang these. Essentially, I'm going to do a cleat on the top and bottom. I'll cut a couple of scrap pieces of cedar to length, short enough so they'll fit on the inside of our shutter frame. You can see what I mean here in this shot. I'll fasten these cleats to our brick by pre-drilling a couple of holes. I'll use Tapcon screws to connect these cleats to our brick. First, I'll pre-drill a hole using my drill, and then I'll use the impact driver to sink the Tapcon anchors into the wall. These will be spaced so that they align with the top and the bottom of the shutters. I couldn't find my little bubble level, so I used my phone for the first time ever, and it worked great. In total, I ran through 2 different drill bits installing these 6 shutters. I'll also make sure to leave links to all the other tools, materials, and supplies for this project. I secured the shutters to the bottom cleat with these short finish screws. That way they would be able to recess into the board and be hidden really easily, but I didn't have access to the top of the frame to drill into the higher cleat, so I just used a few finish nails. That first set looks awesome, and it's the perfect height for our windows. It fills the space, and even though they don't technically close, the bottom is sitting above the brick ledge. And now that these are certified Super Pro, I'm gonna build 2 more sets. For this though, I'm gonna play some music and do a montage. Roll it. That's 1 down, 3 to go. Nailed it. I purposefully built my new shutters so that they would be a little bit bigger than the old ones, especially when I realized how much construction adhesive was still stuck to the brick. And the last shutters really weren't terrible. They were kind of that modern farmhouse vibe. I think you could sand them, stain them, and rehang them, and they would look great. But this style is very new and fresh feeling. I like it a lot. The installation on the front porch was way easier because I wasn't climbing around a ladder. I could just use a little step stool and get these hung quickly. It's important to use a level during installation. Don't just trust your eye or reference the edge of some brick or a window. Be sure that it's correct. And we are done. So if you'll remember, before we had what you would call modern farmhouse shutters. They're not bad, but they were falling off the wall because it just had construction adhesive attaching them to the brick. But check out the after. These new shutters are killer and they were really easy to build. Even with a limited tool set, they're not too complicated, but they were really elevated in comparison to what we had before. And the Cedar Pickets for each one of these shutters really only cost like $10. Awesome. So big thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Modern Builds. Or Mike's First Flips. Who knows? They're kind of running together at this point, but we'll see you next time.